very strange. It's the third time I've seen the film, and I'm probably more emotional seeing it this afternoon than I've ever been before. You take something new out of it each time you see it, but you also take something out of the reaction of your audience. And I could feel the understanding of the audience. I could touch it, and that really made it very special. I don't know whether you share my emotions. I have two emotions above all else. One is pride, and the other, surprisingly, is anger. I'm angry. I'm angry that people do not see Israel as that film shows you Israel. I'm angry that there are people who damn Israel without wanting to understand the history, without having any education about what it's really about, and with a blindness that I find hard to understand. I find it incredibly hard to understand intelligent academics, some of them Jewish, some of them Israeli, but across the world, who want to boycott Israel, who want to boycott Israel's wonderful things that it can give the world. And we say to the boycotters when they want to boycott us, okay, you want to boycott Israel, then be consistent. Be consistent. Don't use your mobile phone. Don't write the letters damning Israel on your computer, because your computer depends on a lot of Israeli technology. And many, many other things. Don't use a lot of the medication that comes out of Israeli research. I'm going to be a bit of a grasshopper now because I want to share quite a few things with you, and I'm going to jump around a bit, and please forgive me. But there are certain additional things that I really do want to share. The first thing is that you need to know that there is a lot of cooperation that is going on between Israelis and Palestinians at grassroots level. If you see the BBC, and I would love to make this compulsive viewing for every BBC reporter. And what annoys me most is that when the interviewers who interview people and allow them to say the most outrageous things about Israel, and most outrageous allegations, and don't have the knowledge to challenge it, or worse still, don't have the will to challenge it, then of course one does get rather angry. But there is so much good out there. You saw an awful lot of it in the film. But what you don't realise so much is that, for example, the Rambam hospital in Haifa, where a friend of mine has just been treated, and she said in that hospital, less than 20% of the patients are Jewish. The majority of them are Muslims and Druze. And not only that, but the people working alongside each other, the doctors, the nurses, and everybody else, it's the Palestinians and the Israelis and the Muslims working alongside each other. So we mustn't get into this mindset that everybody is against Israel or that it's all bad. But if you read our media, if you read The Guardian, or as I say, you go to the BBC, you see nothing but negativity. What about apartheid, that word that we're accused of? Israel as the apartheid state. Well, you've got enough examples in the film, never mind anything else. But it's the least apartheid country in the world. It's taken in different nationalities, different religions. The religions are together side by side. Unfortunately, a lot of the Christians are choosing to move out of the Muslim areas into Jewish areas because they don't feel comfortable. And yet a lot of people try to blame Israel and say that it's Israel driving out the Christians. And we know that's not true. And as far as I say, apartheid, it just doesn't exist in Israel. There's no segregation, there's no... all right, people will say that the Israeli Arabs may not be absolutely top-of-the-range first-class citizens, but believe me, I listened to a Palestinian speaker not that long ago. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Khaled Abu Tomeh, who writes in the Jerusalem Post. He writes in the Jerusalem Post because he says that as far as he's concerned as a Palestinian, it's the only newspaper he's allowed to tell the truth in. And he is an amazing man who exposes an awful lot. But he will tell you, as far as Israeli Arabs are concerned, probably 98%, he puts it out, wouldn't live anywhere other than Israel. And when it came to some time back in 2000, when in 2000 we actually had hope that there was going to be some move towards peace. And I think the offer on the table was that 97% of what the Palestinians wanted was going to be given to them. And 3% of land was going to change hands. There was an area where there were Palestinians living, and they would go over to the Palestinian side, and that would make up 3%. No way, those Palestinians wouldn't buy it. They didn't want to be moved under Palestinian control. The tragedy is that as far as the Palestinians are concerned, and as far as, say, Hamas, Hezbollah and Fatah, they're fighting each other. We don't have a partner for peace in Israel at the moment. Israel, I truly believe that pretty well all Israelis and most grassroots Palestinians equally want peace. The Palestinians want the opportunity to get on with their lives. They don't want all this fighting and what have you. And the other thing that they want is the fact that millions and millions of dollars and pounds, and believe me, hundreds of thousands of British pounds as we speak, are going to the Palestinians. And I would believe in that, and I would support it if I thought that money was going where it was intended. And if it was going where it was intended, then the Palestinians living in Gaza, and I'm quite sure that for some of the Palestinians living in Gaza, it's hell on earth. I'm not pretending that it's any different. But there are two sides to society in Gaza as well as there are elsewhere. And there's the rich side of Gaza, and there's the... And I once did a little test because I couldn't believe it when I saw that there was this very upmarket restaurant and country club in Egypt Street in Gaza. And I thought, you know what, I don't actually believe that. So I made a telephone call. I made a telephone call to make a reservation at the restaurant. And I didn't believe it would exist, but believe me, it did. And I made my reservation for 8 people to have dinner on Saturday night. Needless to say, I didn't turn up. But I proved that this is really happening there. But if that money was going to the right sources, you wouldn't have a refugee problem. You wouldn't have a problem where Gazans are living in great poverty, and you would have a decent society. It's not going there. It's going to pay terrorists in prison, it's going to pay suicide bombers' families, and it's going to put into the pockets of corrupt people. And this is why, when Arafat died, I forget what his fortune was, but I know that his widow now, who rushed to his bedside when he was dying, but wasn't very often seen near him when he was alive, she gets a very nice amount every year out of his bank account, and it's true of a lot of them. What do we want more than anything else? We want what was on the table in 1948. In 1948, it wasn't ideal, but it was by a vote of the United Nations, it was that there was going to be a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state. The vast majority of Israelis believe in this two-state solution. It's the only way. But, as I've said, we need this partner for peace to do it with. And unfortunately, it's not happening. And whilst they may tell the international world that Abbas may say that he wants peace and he's prepared to make peace, he then goes away and it's one thing out of one side of the mouth and the other thing out of the other side. And what he tells his people, the Arab people, is exactly what they want, and that is they want, as far as to drive out Israel, to have no Jewish state. The one tiny Jewish state. I don't know how many of you, I know that I'm preaching to the converted here to a very large extent. So I know that if I tell you that Israel fits into Wales, that you will understand it. But people who don't know it think of Israel as this great, big, aggressive country and only out for war and land grabbing. It just isn't true. Oddly enough, the land that was given to Israel in the early stages in 1948 was not the best of land. And they, as you saw, they cleared the swamps and they improved the situation. And they did make the desert bloom. And there's no question this irrigation, and no doubt many of you have got this kind of thing even in your gardens where you use some kind of irrigation of that. All that kind of thing that started in Israel. Another thing that was water conservation was the two different buttons that you can press on your cistern, the big button and the small button, invented in Israel to save water. Things of that nature are so important. The other thing is that Israel, not just the examples you saw there, but they do go around the world, they do help people, they do what they can. Not perfect by any means. Things go wrong. I'm sure, as in any army, there are bad eggs from time to time in the army. You hear a lot about checkpoints, you hear a lot about settlements and all the negativity. But at the end of the day, the vast majority in the IDF are decent people with high standards. And it was Richard Kemp of the who was the commander of the British forces in Afghanistan, who went to the United Nations and actually told the United Nations that never in the history of warfare has a country done more to protect civilians when it has to go into war than Israel. And there's all this type of thing. What else do I want to tell you? In terms of cooperation, in the Galilee there's now a big high-tech centre where Palestinians are having company startups working together. A couple of things have been overtaken by time. Israel now has its own gas supply, and that is believed could well change the economy. And many developments. I mentioned before what happened in Boston, and the doctor in the hospital there has actually gone on record thanking the Israelis for some of the things that they have been able to do in coping with the disaster, because 2 years ago they called Israelis in to help them how to cope with disaster. Sadly, Israelis have had to cope with many disasters over the years, and so that the hospital there has actually thanked Israel for what it did there. I saw a short clip this morning that came into my inbox. It's a YouTube video. It frightened me, it upset me, because it related to Boston and it related to 2004 and 2011. In 2004, the Muslims in Boston wanted to build a mosque. The municipality, or the authority there, handed over the land and gave them the facility to build one of the biggest mosques in America. Sadly, what is coming out of that mosque in preaching has, I think, been a precursor to what happened this week in Boston. And it is truly awful. The same thing is going on in teaching children over in the Muslim countries. Their television programs and what they read in their schools teaches them, and it's not just Jews, it's Jews and Christians, because the majority of them, anybody who is not a Muslim is an infidel, anybody who doesn't believe in Islam is an infidel. And we're compared, what are we compared to? Pigs and apes and dogs. And this is what they are teaching their children. And until we can get a society that wants peace and wants to teach their children peace, when you see a child this high in kindergarten reciting a poem, an anti-Jewish or anti-anything poem, and being applauded by their teachers for calling Jews apes and pigs, and when you know that there was a school in London that had those textbooks as well, and when in their idiocy the government decided that instead of Muslim schools being examined by Ofsted, that they could self-examine, you just wonder what kind of mentality there is. You just wonder. What about the so-called siege of Gaza, and our lovely George Galloway and his people? All I can say is, what siege of Gaza? I don't know how many of you have seen pictures of what there is in Gaza now. There is no siege. When Lauren Booth, the sister-in-law of Tony Blair, went, she was caught in the supermarket, a very well-stocked supermarket, I can show you the pictures of the well-stocked supermarkets, I can show you the bustling beaches, I can show you the beautiful homes, and so it should be. Don't think I'm criticising that, so it should be. But everybody needs to know that, and they need to know that they're, on a daily basis, the trucks roll in from Israel into Gaza, taking in supplies. Israel supplies the electricity. You get accused that Israel is stealing the water. Israel makes sure that they have the water. And yet we hear this nonsense of the siege of Gaza. I don't know how many of you felt that it was appropriate that the Israeli Prime Minister should apologise to the Turks for what happened on the Mavi Mavara. I most certainly didn't, because my grandson is friends with some of those boys who, as they came down onto that boat, were beaten half to death, and where the world was stupid enough to say that these boys were coming down shooting as they came, and people believed it. Well, I don't know about you, but if I'm on a rope with my two hands like this coming down, I'm not saying that was a particularly good exercise, I'm not particularly saying that, but they certainly weren't shooting as they went, and they certainly were beaten half to death by the fact that they'd torn off the sides of the boat and used iron rods. So I was unhappy. I know that it's important that Turkey comes back into the sort of fold, and I understand the politics of that, but they've reneged on every promise they made, They said that they wouldn't go to court. They said, and now they're asking, if you don't mind, for $1 million for each of the 9 people who died. And I think Israel is willing to pay $100,000, and it's $100,000 too much as far as I'm concerned. And I say, where's the compensation for the boys who came down and were beaten? So there's that side of things. The United Nations, the Human Rights Council, absolutely incredible. Israel accused of breaking United Nations resolutions. Whoever says that doesn't read the resolution properly, because there isn't a single resolution that's been broken. And the Human Rights Council ought to be renamed, because there's nothing about human rights that council deals with except Israel. And when you know what's going on in Syria, and you know that I think they're approaching something like 200,000 deaths, I think it is, and 20,000 tortured, and the world just turns a blind eye, and it turns a blind eye everywhere else. What does Israel want? As I say, an even playing field. To be treated the same as everybody else, not to be expected to be different. I think Israel does want to have higher standards than some countries and tries, but it's a normal country that over 65 years has grown with the normal problems that any country has, and understandably so. It has its crime, it has various other aspects that we're not proud of, but nevertheless, it needs to be treated fairly. Again, on the question of what we do around the world, there's a number of outstandingly surprising to me things, and I will eventually find them in 1 second at the bottom of one of my pieces of paper. Right. The Israelis have provided a new medical centre in Bulgaria, a power plant in Sumatra, a water control system in China, and at the moment Israel, Cyprus and Greece are working on a new joint strategic plan. That's not a country that wants to be at war with anybody. It's a country that wants to actually do it the best it can for its people. I want to leave just a few moments, if I can, for some questions, but I just want to... Mike, how are we doing? I think it's for... No, okay, fine. I just sort of want to share one or two of the things that we saw there. Learn to fail or fail to learn. I find that quite an interesting concept. I think that's one we can take away with us. And the other is a question of taking an idea and putting it into action. Well, if I may say so, I think you as a community are an example of taking an idea and putting it into action. And the other thing, there was a question on there. What are you going to do to make the world a better place? And I suggest that maybe if all of us take nothing else away with us today, maybe take that resonating in our minds. What are you going to do to make the world a better place? I have to tell you, when I come here, I actually feel enveloped in a kind of warmth and a love and an appreciation. And I'm thanked and appreciated. But for me, I want to be thanking you. I really, really do. Because to have a group of people who are prepared to research what it's all about, to understand what it's all about, and from your Christian belief, to realise the value of Israel, to realise the importance of that country, and to stand side by side with us. You know, very often, Israelis and Jews feel very alone, and unfortunately, there is a growth of anti-Semitism, there is no doubt about it, that it is growing again. And yet we know that we have so many amazing friends. We have communities like yours, we have Christian Friends of Israel, we have Anglican Friends of Israel. Believe it or not, we have Muslim Friends of Israel, and we have a good relationship. In Manchester we have a Muslim-Jewish association, and slowly, slowly, whereas it all started out just talking on a religious level and steering clear of any of the actual problematic issues. And I said it's all very nice to have a Muslim-Jewish association, but you've got to be prepared to reach the point where you will actually face the real issues together, where you will talk about the Israel-Palestinian situation, and where you will try to come to some kind of conclusions. So from the point of view of coming here and feeling that warmth, and knowing that we do have friends, and knowing that there really are people who are prepared to understand, and all I want to say to those people who haven't seen the light, so to speak, is just go to the history. Just start back in 1948 or even earlier, because there are people who actually don't want to believe that the Jews have a right to be in Israel. They don't believe that there is a lengthy history of almost time immemorial that Jews have been there. And I remember that we had an awful exhibition at Manchester Cathedral, to its shame, and it had this exhibition of painting, supposedly by children of Gaza, with the most horrible captioning. It was created, I think Stephen Sizer probably had something to do with it. I think Stephen Sizer had something to do with it. And there were people manning the exhibition, and some of my friends used to keep an eye on it from time to time and go in. And they were talking to one of the ladies who was manning it, who actually said there was no war of independence. Well, if you start trying to talk to somebody at that level, you don't stand a chance. So what I'm really saying is that the more you can do as ambassadors to talk to people, to tell them, to ask them to do their own research. Don't believe me, don't believe, but to actually research, to learn the history, to see the history of the various wars that there have been, and to know that they have not been wars of Israel's choice, because Israel, I mean, we've had 65 years, we've had 65 years without one day of real peace. It's all very well the handshakes on the lawn, it's all very well to see Jordan and Egypt so-called at peace with Israel. It's a very cold peace. It's a very cold peace. And certainly since the so-called Arab Spring, if that was meant to bring benefit to any countries, I'm yet to see it, and it is difficult. And with the Muslim Brotherhood growing, etc., we're not in a very good place. But on the other hand, we are in a very good place. According to the film, we're in a better place. And to be truthful, when you look at that and you see what's going on and you know that there are good people out there and that the benefit is going out to the world, I think it's probably true that we can say that we have lived up in Israel. And I say we because all of us, I have children living in Israel. I have 3 grandchildren who were born there. As I say, my granddaughter is the youngest of them. They've all been through the army, and they're all getting on with their lives. But I think we can probably say, I hope we can say, that that aim of Israel being a light unto the nations, if the film teaches us one thing, I think it truly shows that we are not perfect, certainly not perfect. A lot to learn. Hold up your hands when you've made a mistake and admit it and say sorry, because it does happen. But at the same time, there is so much to take away from that film that we can be proud of. There is so much to share. There is so much good there that I hope that that has brought you that message, and that we will, I know, particularly here, because I know you pray for it as much as we do, that elusive peace, we have to keep a degree of hope. I'm not optimistic. I have to be perfectly honest at this point in time. I am not optimistic. But on the other hand, Israel is a country that is peppered with miracles. If you think about the 1948, there is no way Israel should have survived that onslaught in 1948. There is no way that we weren't virtually at the point of annihilation with the Yom Kippur War when we were taken by surprise. And the various intifadas, what have they proved? You've got the situation in Jenin, where you thought, reading about Jenin, that the whole of Jenin had been flattened. In fact, it was just the refugee area, not true. The British government sent a team of builders to Jenin to rebuild. They also did some rebuilding in Gaza when Israel did some rebuilding in Gaza when Gaza was in Israeli hands. The United Nations passed a resolution that made Israel undo all the better buildings that it had created because it was changing the status quo, and the British builders were sent home. Sent home with the message that we don't want your help. By building better accommodation and improving the situation, you are, and listen to this, jeopardizing our refugee status. That was the leadership. That is what we're up against. That is the problem. But through all that, we will go on trying. Israel will go on trying, holding out the hand of friendship. There's a new government. I've got reasonable amount of hope that there's enough new blood coming in that Netanyahu is beginning to talk about. Really, his objective has to be peace. He was asked recently, I think on a radio program or something, how he would like to be remembered. He actually said he would like to be remembered for creating a more secure Israel. I would like him to say he would like to be remembered as the Prime Minister who managed, if not to finish bringing peace to Israel, at least to start it. And then I think there is some hope. But I just thank you so much for me, a really inspirational experience. I love coming here. I really, really mean it. And to see the dancers, to feel the music, and to share this with you, and to feel, I could actually feel the emotion coming out. And as far as an audience is concerned, your reaction to the funny parts and everything else is the best reaction I've had in showing the film. And it's been a wonderful afternoon, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Joy. Wasn't that inspirational, the film and Joy's talk?